Good morning. It is actually a pleasure to host this European edition of the Symposium on Cultural Diplomacy here at Vesalius College. Allow me just a few words on why I think that actually we are in the right place to talk about cultural diplomacy today. Vesalius College is an American-style college that takes full advantage of its location at the heart of Europe. With an international student body of approximately 300 students and over 60 nationalities, Vesalius is a temple where cultural diplomacy is practiced on a daily basis. As you know, definitions of diplomacy, of cultural diplomacy, emphasize the exchange of ideas and information, art and culture, in order to foster mutual understanding. And they further emphasize the fact that these connections should tie not only countries, but their people. No wonder, therefore, that the European Union needs places like this in order to pioneer cultural diplomatic practice. But beside our own daily experience, and I am sure that we here are actually sharing the same commitment, I think that it's actually very important that we are gathering here to talk about cultural diplomacy. There is no doubt that culture is not just an instrument. It is an end, a goal in itself that underpins societal cohesions at home, but also build bridges across the borders. Along these lines, in what follow, I will briefly advocate for the benefit of inlaying sound cultural diplomatic practices into a dedicated cultural policy at home and therefore in Europe. In the first place, I believe that if we want to talk culture abroad, we should restore culture at home at first. And there, the picture that we have from Europe is pretty ambivalent. On the one hand, according to the Canadian Council for Art, some countries as Finland, Germany, and France stand out as the most generous sponsor worldwide of direct public expenditures on art and museum, for instance. In parallel, despite the incredible cultural heritage, in 2010, Italy allocated only 0.28% of its operating budget to its Ministry of Culture. Unfortunately, Greece, only in 2011, slashed by 35% the budget for its own cultural ministry. It's not difficult to believe and to understand that over 2,000 people were basically cut off from the Ministry of Culture only that year, and only in that department. So, as with the social cost of this enduring crisis, the gap between European states, and most dramatically within those states, between rich and poor, it's growing exponentially. As a result, today, we have the impression that the rhetoric of united in diversity, coupled with the idea of a strong, peaceful model of regional integration, is falling apart. This leads me to the first point that I want to make here today. To paraphrase from a 2013 book from Richard Haas, As with Foreign Policy, cultural diplomacy begins at home. If the EU wants to restore its potential, it better restore successful stories at home. This is particularly important because the EU has defined itself both in Europe and as an international actor primarily around its power of attraction. What is the role of culture here? Well, in times of crisis, art and culture should be the first investment to make. They are carriers of creativity, innovation, preservation, prosperity, development of new skills, and social capital. And let me actually quote Fabrice here in saying that, sadly, culture is still considered as a luxury, not as an investment. No wonder that in times of crisis, actually, culture and funding for culture and art are the first casualties of austerity measures. And if the commitment of the member states are creeping at the EU level, the situation is not more encouraging, considering, and again I quote your data, that in its multi-annual financial framework, 2014-2020, the Commission proposed to allocate 1.6 billion euro for the cultural sector. We are talking here about less than €1 per capita for each year, and 0.16% of the EU budget, with a growth of 0.003% in the last 15 years. In this overall context, the EU does not have a common cultural policy yet. EU actions are mainly aimed at encouraging cooperation between member states and supplementing their action through the principles of subsidiarity and the open method of coordination. And yet, despite disunity and shrinking budgets, the EU Commission has managed to move some steps in the right direction, I believe. Projects such as access to culture, cultural and creative industries, media, Europeana, are instruments that can help the cultural sector thrive and also communicate the EU outside its border. To be sure, a common cultural policy is not about leveling the incredible richness of our joint cultural heritage, but about enhancing the standard of cultural governance and ensuring the well-being of our best ambassadors, the artists. And here, strictly connected to the first point, it comes my second one. A strong EU cultural diplomacy stems from a synergetic cultural commitment which encompasses domestic and foreign dimensions. The Treaty of the Functioning of European Union, its Article 167, actually recognized this, that the EU shall take cultural aspect into account in its action. Equally, the 2007 European Agenda for Culture emphasized that culture is a vital element in the EU international politics. Along the same lines, the European Parliament recommended in a report dated 2011 that the European External Action Service, the EAS, should include a directorate on cultural and digital diplomacy in its organization and liaise closely with the European Commission to coordinate the strategic deployment of the cultural aspects of external policy. And we are still awaiting for seeing this happen nowadays, actually. In this fast-paced global context, we should realize that both public and cultural diplomacy constitute an integral component of foreign policy. On the one hand, they contribute to framing and maintaining the soft power of an international actor. On the other, they constitute an avenue for communicating with foreign and domestic public in increasing reciprocal understanding. Let me close here with a quote from Professor Kriegel that from the pages of the National Interest said, "Europe's raison d'etre can be restored only by a regeneration of its foundation as based on history and culture. The etymology of the word culture," he proceeds, "refer to the things that needs to be cultivated, implying that these things needs to be cherished for the future. Europe is missing these things now," he concluded, and thus is becoming little more than a civilizational cult. Decline is a choice, it was recently argued, and we are called to decide whether we want to undertake that path. Talking culture through diplomacy is not only a way to build bridges among countries, it is also a way to rebuild our visions of ourselves and to create more inclusive societies at home. I wish you today a very fruitful discussion with interesting results and follow-up. And once again, welcome to Vesalius College. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks, Svetlana, for the $1 million questions. I mean, as I mentioned before, the framework is not there. Certainly, on the one hand, we need to set benchmark. As mentioned before, the beauty of cultural diplomacy and talking about cultural diplomacy is that diversity is at the core of our own action. From that point of view, the very single things that we actually all would benefit from is starting thinking on how to setting a sound benchmark for cultural governance in a variety of sectors. From the point of view of certainly using what we have, so this would be something that already would help profoundly all the member states and in the respect of their diversity. From the point of view of the easiest things to suggest, well, let's start from giving more money to art, because as I mentioned before, clearly we here are missing the central point that culture, it is a vector of development. And if this is not taken into account, I'm afraid we are losing a train. I think that there are some things that we called, first of all, thanks for the question, Caroline. I think there are a few common goods that are not tied up to economic performance. And I really do believe it. This is the case when we talk about water. This is the case when we talk about transport. And this is primarily the case when we talk about culture and art. So in that way, I understand your point, but without a sort of framework which allows our artists to survive, we are not going anywhere. Because unfortunately, as we know, artists really struggles in our cities, and this is not clearly a problem that it's present only in Europe, but well beyond. So yes, if we want to sort of pioneer cultural diplomacy, we certainly need to have a policy of support for art. I understand your point, and I believe that if you actually invest in infrastructure, artists will certainly find a way through independent. And here, let me give you an example. As I mentioned, media. Media is clearly such a platform. I want to remind you in that, and I know it's a little sour as a sort of remark, but as an Italian, we just had an Oscar. But, I mean, the Oscar was, the movie was about the decadence of our culture. So, are we only about decadence? I don't think so. I mean, clearly I love the movie and I think it's very telling, and I've been living in Rome. But yes, this is exactly what you smell in our city. And so there, I mean, investment, building up infrastructure is still something that the public sector should take over as a task. Thank you so much for this question. I said that, just to be precise, that culture is a luxury. Cultural diplomacy right now, in terms of both actually building up a given country or a group of countries' soft power repertoire, it's key today. Because the situation worldwide is far less legible. We cannot any longer sort of recur to the easy shortcuts of the Cold War with a Manichaean words, and a huge portion of the world totally and absolutely forgotten, taken out of the picture. Now we have got a different balance of power at the international level. So it is really the first task to start understanding each other. Said that, and going to the most interesting part of your questions, and I think you really touch a very important point there. Certainly culture, above all in a moment in which we are assisting to the proliferation of civil wars, culture and building bridges is the way forward. It is certainly an instrument that is taken on board not only by the European Union, but several countries here, the attempt of building up programs for mutual understanding. It starts, as usual, at school. You need to bring conflicting parts around desks. You need to bring conflicting parts to talk to each other. This is certainly already happened in situation of post-conflict, and is attempted more and more in situation of conflict, creating bridge, whenever we can access, unfortunately, zones of conflict.